Hi everyone, I'm Sam, an audience planner at Scope. My role is to create engaging and relevant supporter journeys for Scope supporters. I started at the beginning of April just as the pandemic was starting to unfold, so it was certainly an interesting time to come into a new organisation and think about how we engage with supporters. The COVID-19 sentiment tracker has been a fantastic tool to help guide both my own and the wider organisation's thinking during this time with some great results. And in the short time we have today, I'd like to highlight 5 things that the tracker has helped influence at Scope over the last few months. There were a lot of big, scary questions we had to ask ourselves when the pandemic set in without a whole lot of information to go on. The first thing the sentiment tracker did was help us to answer some of these big questions about the impact the pandemic was having and what that meant for us as fundraisers working in a completely new and unexpected situation. The tracker has been a really useful tool to support the team's thinking and to sense check decisions from the very tactical up to executive team level. Like many charities, we had to think about resourcing. A number of the fundraising team went on furlough, and those who stayed worked reduced hours for a period of a few months, while the organisation navigated the period of financial uncertainty that affected so many of us. This meant that with fewer staff hours, we had to really prioritise and focus on the most important pieces of work during that period. The sentiment tracker supported decision making about which activities to stop, start and continue and how to shape them. Referring to sentiment tracker also helped us to demonstrate the importance of communicating with our supporters at this time and to get backing from the wider organisation to focus on supporter engagement as a priority. Similarly, we had to think about the best place to put financial investment. Like many others, our charity shops closed for several weeks, our fundraising events were cancelled, and face-to-face activity paused entirely. This, alongside the wider economic impacts of the pandemic unfolding, meant careful planning and investment in fundraising activity was never more important. The tracker also helped to support our thinking about longer-term and growth plans. Public sentiment was an input used in forecasting and setting expectations at executive and board level, helping to shape our view on what's going to be possible in a difficult external environment. Looking more at supporter engagement, one of the key things we used insights from the tracker for was to put together an ever-evolving map of supporter engagements that aimed to reflect supporters where they were emotionally during the ebbs and flows of sentiment during the pandemic, to meet their expectations of us as a charity during a period of crisis, and to be responsive to current events as they unfolded, with us flexing our messaging quickly to stay relevant. Guided by what the sentiment tracker was telling us, we tried a lot of things that were new to Scope during this time, recognising the importance of getting our communications right during what was a difficult time for everyone. Here are a few of the insights that we acted on. Firstly, in recognition of the insight that people were feeling anxious and out of control, we created and shared some free wellbeing content and advice. We recognised that this was something that we could share with our supporters, giving back to them in a meaningful way that was relevant to what they were experiencing in the present. We did this in a couple of ways. The first was via free Mindful Monsters content. Mindful Monsters is Scope's subscription product that's been developed alongside mindfulness experts to help children explore mindfulness and learn important life skills like resilience. We developed additional Mindful Monsters material to provide to supporters at the very start of lockdown to help them and their families during that stressful time. The second thing was by drawing on our internal expertise to share proven mental wellbeing advice with supporters more recently at the beginning of the second wave, when anxiety started to peak again. As part of our services for disabled people at Scope, our experienced practitioners have a wealth of knowledge to support with issues like anxiety. We worked with them to create a list of simple tips for supporters, as well as sharing a detailed list of where to go for more help for anyone who felt they needed it. The next insights we identified were that people were still really keen to help others, and that they were seeking some good news amongst all the negatives. We saw that, especially at the beginning of lockdown, there was a sense of us all being in it together and that we needed to help each other. The pandemic put many people into really difficult situations, and that's especially true for Scope beneficiaries, with many disabled people facing even greater challenges. So we sought to feed back to supporters more than ever to show them the difference that they were making, sharing more frequent updates of what their support was helping to achieve for disabled people during the pandemic, and to give them hope that we'd be able to make it all through. As demand for our services went up, we were able to meet it, but only thanks to the generosity of our donors. So we made sure that letting them know the difference they were making was front and centre of our communications. Finally, the sentiment tracker identified that people were worried about the economy and their personal finances, especially as the pandemic wore on and the stories of mass job losses became more frequent. A sizable number of charity supporters growing over time stated that they would consider reducing the amount they donate. It was clear that it was more important than ever to build as deep a connection as possible with our supporters to help ensure that they wanted to stick with us, so we reached out to them in new ways. In a time when many people, especially more vulnerable groups, were isolated because of the virus and the restrictions we were living with, We phoned our supporters to say thank you and to listen to what they had to say and what they needed. We were able to offer payment holidays or adjustments to gifts if that was something they wanted, but mostly we wanted to let them know how much we appreciated them. Our retention results indicate that this seems to have paid off. Comparing actual cancellations to budget, we're currently running at about 75% of the cancellations we would have predicted at the start of the year. Of course, some of that is because recruitment has been lower because of the pause in face-to-face fundraising. But looking at our more established supporters recruited over a year ago, to see retention patterns over the last few months, we have seen our retention rates hold steady all through the pandemic with no real spikes in cancellations at any point. It's been really reassuring to see that our older cohorts are sticking with us during this difficult period. We also saw from the sentiment tracker that despite the upheaval to their lives, many people still wanted to help others. And with the problems that we're facing in society, country and planet feeling so huge, there's a real need for a lot of people to be able to do something tangible and feel like they were making a positive difference. Importantly, we also saw that disability ranked high as a cause that people continued to care about during the pandemic, even though Scope itself wasn't ranking as a charity people were specifically likely to donate to. We saw this as an opportunity to really maximise our campaigning for disabled people during the pandemic, and encouraged by what we were seeing in the sentiment tracker, we made a lot more of it than we normally would have, especially to our warm supporters with whom we don't normally go so deep with our campaigning asks. During the pandemic, the impact on disabled people was a critical issue. We saw time and again that disabled people's needs were not being met by the government as various restrictions came into place. We started our We Won't Be Forgotten campaign to address this and hold the government to account. The major push for this over the summer was our open letter to the Prime Minister, which gained over 30,000 signatures and set out what needed to happen to ensure disabled people were not left behind. As well as being a powerful message to the government, this campaign action was also a chance to demonstrate to our supporters that Scope had solutions to the problem that disabled people were facing and was not afraid to push hard for them. We came together as an organisation to work in a much more integrated way, with our campaigning and fundraising contributing to the same goal for Scope during the pandemic, that is, doing everything we can to ensure disabled people's needs were being met in these exceptional times. Everyone at Scope pulled together behind this one campaign, seeing this as our moment to have a real impact and show that we can provide solutions to the problems disabled people are facing. We've seen the fruits of this externally, with Scope being a prominent voice in the media when disability issues connected to the pandemic are discussed, which is something that could also go some way to addressing the gap between disability as an important cause and propensity to donate to Scope specifically. With such a tangible and timely call to action, it was also a great time to activate our broader supporter base, not just our campaigners, but also groups who would not typically engage with this kind of activity. So typically our warm donors would receive campaign actions as part of the wider supporter journey they're on, but it would not be as prominent as how we engage with our campaigner audience. But this time we communicated with all of our warm financial supporters in the same way as we would with our campaigning audience. They received the campaign ask, reminders, updates on how the action was going, and were asked to share with their friends and family to make the movement as broad as possible. The engagement from our warm supporters was great. The click-through rates to the campaign action page were about 3 times what we'd normally see from an email call to action. But even better, we used the campaign to reach out to a number of lapsed segments, people who hadn't engaged with Scope in any way for some time, some of them years. Some of these groups responded even better than our warm donors, with open rates reaching 50% for some segments and click rates of up to 25%. That's well above what we'd see for our emails normally. In all, we activated over 2,000 new campaigners, which is an incredible achievement compared to past actions. Another great benefit of using the insights from the sentiment tracker was its contribution to helping us unlock supporter generosity and achieve our income targets. It played a role in helping us to connect with supporters to ask them for money in the right way and at the right time. For our appeals, the insights that disability is a relevant and important cause, and that people are looking for tangible ways to support important causes, were of course highly relevant and reassuring as we looked for the best way to ask for donations. Another really key insight from the sentiment tracker, which we kept front of mind, was the need for a consistent, simple and relevant message throughout the pandemic. We saw growing evidence of what has been called COVID brain, so that is people feeling stressed and overwhelmed and therefore having limited capacity to engage with complex issues. For a charity to cut through and have their need be recognised and acted on by supporters, it has to be as clear and simple as possible. Our campaign ask, as described earlier, was a clear and simple message that disabled people were being left behind and forgotten, and we needed supporters to stand with us and take action. This single focus message carried over into our fundraising as we sought to integrate as much as possible across the organisation. Our appeals this year varied in topics and case studies, but all came back to that one core idea, that we need donations to make sure disabled people are not forgotten during the pandemic and the fallout that's still to come. Like many other charities, we did an emergency appeal during the pandemic in April, and we did a follow-up to this appeal in July, continuing the story of how disabled people are being affected by the pandemic and how Scope is able to help thanks to our supporters. By being clear and relevant to what was going on in the world and what our supporters cared about, we had a great response to our fundraising ask in these emergency appeals. Income for our first appeal was 440% of target, and the follow-up was 171% of target, better than we could ever have expected right now. What was especially exciting to see was that a range of new supporters outside of our established cash base responded to the appeal for the first time. We had thousands more responses than we normally would, many of these from first-time appeal donors. And this was despite there being no physical form in the pack due to the challenge of fulfilling this during lockdown. Supporters were engaged enough to go online or to call our supporter care team to make their donation. As well as being a contributor to the great results of the emergency appeals, it's also really great news for our fundraising in the longer term, as it means that our pool of supporters for upcoming cash appeals has increased. We have a broader audience we can go out to with our upcoming Christmas appeal, of newly engaged supporters with whom our focus message about the needs of disabled people at this time clearly resonates with. These appeals and our other appeals and raffles that have gone out to supporters so far have done so well that Scope's retention team hit its income target for the year 5 months early. And the final highlight I'd like to share is how the sentiment tracker informed the restarting of our face-to-face fundraising. At the beginning of the pandemic, as we went into the first national lockdown, our face-to-face fundraising was halted, as was the case for everyone. This is really major for us as we are completely dependent on fundraised income with no income from services, and the vast majority of this comes from face-to-face. Pausing this has long-term implications for income, and it was therefore important for us to identify the best opportunities for how and when to restart this when we could, to ensure the financial sustainability of our work for our beneficiaries in the future. The sentiment tracker helped to support our conversation on this. When we were reviewing our options around face-to-face fundraising, we were thinking about door-to-door, private site, and other options for restarting. External tracking like this gave us confidence in a way to back up our thought processes and helped us to position our recommendation with Scope's leadership team as our best option. Our eventual decision to return to face-to-face fundraising outside selected Scope charity shops as they reopened in June was based on what we were seeing, that people did still want to give to charity and that they felt reasonably comfortable with charity shops as a site for face-to-face fundraising, where people could choose whether or not to engage in a socially distanced way. We were, I believe, one of the first charities to return to face-to-face fundraising, and the campaign went well considering the really challenging operating environment. We were running the campaign at a small scale to start with, a few dozen supporters across a selection of our shops, and we've signed up over 3,000 new supporters so far. The projected income of this is over 400,000 over the next 5 years. The numbers are obviously well below what our recruitment would look like in a normal year, but it's from a baseline that was looking like zero, situation that many charities are facing after this year. It's also great to be able to continue to have great conversations with Scope supporters during this time. We used our lottery product as the basis for sign-ups. It's a really simple ask, a good conversation starter, and something that potentially gives a little bit of excitement and happiness in supporters' lives, something that we all need after this year. Until the second lockdown was announced, we were expecting to bring in a few thousand more new supporters by the end of the year and increase to 20,000 next year, but we will need to wait and see. What we have seen so far shows that this is sustainable and scalable. It also gives us a little bit of breathing space to shift away from our current almost total reliance on face-to-face and give us a bit more time to invest, test and learn with other acquisition methods for the coming year so that we can scale up things like our phone and digital acquisition routes. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share our work with you today, and I hope you found something useful in what we've learned over the last few months.